Off the British coast, there are sharks in the water. Over the last several weeks, headlines across the United Kingdom have reportedly drawn the nation's attention to a rising threat. Russian warships operating just off the coast, carrying out missions unknown. Their presence hasn't simply been benign. Over the last several weeks, those ships have repeatedly targeted British aircraft with lasers when they've come sniffing around, and they've made a transparently obvious show of lurking just barely outside British territorial waters. Right now, there's a hybrid war playing out across Europe, and make no mistake, these ships off the British coast are part of it. Their objectives may be unclear, their presence may not be illegal, but that doesn't mean they're not a threat, and all outward indications would suggest that they could be working towards something devastating. It's on Britain to figure out what those vessels are up to, and to decide whether London believes it's worth it to take the actions required to stop them. Lurking offshore. Measuring about the length of 108 meters, carrying a crew complement of 60 and displacing a bit short of 6,000 tons, the Russian ship known as the Yantar hardly looks like a threat. Technically speaking, according to Russia, the ship is an oceanic research vessel, but according to the rest of the world, and particularly the nations of NATO, the Yantar is a spy ship built to leverage its autonomous submarines and other high-tech equipment to conduct crucial undersea reconnaissance. It's part of Russia's main directorate for deep-sea research, otherwise known as GUGI, and while GUGI's vessels reportedly work towards scientific objectives, they report directly to the Russian Ministry of Defense. And until quite recently, Russia's Yantar has been sitting off the British coast, presently less than 55 kilometers away from the UK's territorial waters. Naturally, when a suspected spy ship pops up on any nation's coastline, that nation is going to be a little bit curious about what that ship is doing there. According to British Defence Secretary and notable friend of WarFronts, John Healey, speaking to the nation's parliament on... Notable friend. We did an interview with him, which was cool. A friend might be overblowing it. But, yeah, cool. Speaking to the nation's parliament on the 19th of November, the UK did exactly that once the Yantar entered the UK's outer coastal waters. The British Royal Navy sent 8 frigates, while the Royal Air Force sent multiple patrol aircraft, the American-made and very well-armed Boeing 737 variants, the P-8 Poseidon. But as soon as those Poseidon aircraft approached the Yantar, again a Russian vessel operating in British coastal waters, they were targeted by way of a dazzling attack in which the vessel's operators shone powerful lasers at the incoming aircraft. Of course, it should go without saying that lasering the eyes of an aircraft pilot under any circumstances is very dangerous. It causes disorientation, potential loss of control, and depending on the strength of the laser used, even blindness. According to Healey, it was the first time that any Russian ship had directed lasers at RAF pilots in their own coastal waters. Flight tracking data suggested the British Eurofighters also responded, and thus may also have been targeted with the lasers in question. From that point onward, the British military took to monitoring the Yantar very closely, with Healey threatening that, quote, if the Yantar travels south this week, we're ready. The implication of that threat was clear based on the Yantar's position at the time. If it had travelled south, it would have entered Britain's territorial waters, and it would likely have been fired upon. According to Healey, the British Navy had changed other rules of engagement to allow it to monitor the Yantar more closely while it was within Britain's larger exclusive economic zone. But although the vessel was watched closely for the duration of its stay, it wasn't formally stopped, boarded, or fired upon, and clearly, given the fact that it hasn't currently been fired upon, its captain or someone in the Kremlin decided not to travel south. Russia, of course, didn't take kindly to the attention shown to the ship, accusing the UK of being, quote, Russophobic and engaging in, quoting again, military hysteria. Days later, Britain's Ministry of Defense announced another pair of offending Russian warships, this time including a corvette called the Stoiky and a military tanker called the Yelnya. This time, the 2 Russian ships had been attempting to travel through the English Channel, and specifically the Channel's narrowest point, where the territorial waters of Britain and the territorial waters of France overlap. Although this entitles France and Britain to collaborate and bar traffic through the Channel, that typically doesn't happen. But in this case, Britain took the relatively rare step of intercepting the coming vessels, monitoring them, and then handing them off to another NATO member once they left the Channel. As the British government explained it at the time, the ships were the latest indicator of Russia's willingness to aggressively probe into NATO waters, with Defense Secretary Healey noting at the time that Russian vessels have threatened UK waters at a 30% higher clip over the past 2 years than they'd done before. Partial explanations. Now, in order to understand just why this Russian naval presence matters, we've got to introduce a few pieces of context that can help to flesh out and partially explain the situation. First, we've got to emphasize that although Russian ship activity near the UK constantly makes news as the two nations find themselves on opposite sides of the Ukraine conflict, this is far from an isolated incident. In 2025 alone, there have been several occasions in which the British Royal Navy has monitored Russian warships coming uncomfortably close. In February, for example, 6 Russian naval and merchant ships sailed through the channel while carrying ammunition that was being evacuated from Syria during Russia's semi-withdrawal. In March, the UK tracked 3 Russian spy ships through the channel, and in June they watched as a Russian corvette escorted multiple oil tankers from the nation's shadow fleet. In July, the UK watched as a submarine, a frigate, and a corvette traveled through the channel into the North Sea, and in September, the UK tracked 4 Russian warships in the same area, including that same submarine as it returned to port. So although London certainly isn't willing to allow Russian warships to travel unmonitored near the British coast, it's not unprecedented that these ships would be in British waters. In fact, it's worth noting that if a Russian ship wants to leave the Baltic Sea, either by way of its ports near St. Petersburg or from its exclave territory in Kaliningrad, it has little choice but to sail near the UK in some way. If that ship is trying to get to the Atlantic, it's got to go either through the English Channel or go north between Scotland and the Faroe Islands as it's leaving the North Sea. Under maritime law, the English Channel is defined as an international strait, even in areas where French and British maritime territory overlap, and as a result, neither France nor Britain have historically attempted to close off the channel to Russian traffic, at least before last week. But what Russian ships are not entitled to do under maritime or any other law is to shoot lasers at British pilots, and that part, at least, is new. We can partially explain Russia's willingness to escalate and engage in a new type of provocation toward the UK by looking at Russia's recent actions elsewhere across Europe. Ever since nearly 24 unarmed Russian drones entered Polish airspace on the 9th and 10th of September, Russia has clearly transitioned into a phase of escalating provocations against Europe. Those escalations have included drone and armed aircraft incursions onto NATO's eastern flank, unexplained drone overflights above sensitive military facilities and major airports, acts of sabotage like November's explosion on Polish railway lines, and more. Russia hasn't exactly confirmed the strategic thinking behind those recent escalations, which it has refused to acknowledge in any way. But Russia's purpose is widely understood to be trying to challenge NATO, to test its resolve, measure its willingness, or lack thereof, to swallow the potential political costs and engage in a response, and to try and probe NATO members' ability to deal with these sorts of operations. So in that sense, Russian ships regularly sailing close to Britain, or Russia sending a known spy ship to hang out in British waters, can be understood as a sort of reminder. Russia's here, Russia's watching, Russia may or may not be up to something nefarious, and the British, they're not willing to stop it. For Moscow, that might be especially meaningful when targeting the UK specifically, because partly due to distance, partly due to the strength of UK law enforcement and intelligence, and partly because Russian and Eastern European operatives can't blend in as easily as they could in places like Poland, Russia has been unwilling or unable to engage in regular acts of more significant sabotage on British soil. Next up, we're going to explain the true purpose behind Russia's maritime incursions. But before we do that, we've got a question to ask. Do you enjoy what we do here at WarFronts? Do you want more episodes, more analysis, deeper insights into the stories that are shaping our world? Do you crave these kinds of stories at the intersection of grand strategy, global conflict, and geopolitics?
Yes! Yes!
Well, that's why our team has recently unveiled Fronts.co. It's our brand new website designed to provide you with exactly that. Our writers at WarFronts and our sister channel, Political Fronts, gather at Fronts.co to take an even closer look at the wars, the strategy, the politics, and the technology that define this moment in history. Every week, we release 2 exclusive video episodes that can't be found anywhere else, including our Briefing Room series, a regular roundup of underreported stories that do deserve your attention. Also on Fronts.co, we publish 2 expert articles each week, drawing on journalists and analysts who've chosen to share their insights with our audience and the wider world. One recent article explored a topic very similar to this one, diving deep, pun intended, on Russia's Deep Sea Research Directorate. Elsewhere on the site, you'll get early access to every extended deep dive episode we release here on WarFronts, plus inside access to behind-the-scenes content, unreleased episodes, new merch offerings, and more. A subscription costs just $5 a month, and it helps us grow our free offerings here and on Political Fronts as well. So if you want to support this channel and get a ton of content in return, head to Fronts.co. We'll pop a link in the description below. And thank you for your support. Undersea Targets. But all of that still doesn't quite explain the presence of the Yantar specifically, and it's worth emphasizing that of all the assets available to Russia today, the Yantar and ships like it pose a greater threat than nearly anything else in Russia's arsenal. The UK is an island nation, or really it's an archipelago nation, but for our purposes today, that's just semantics. Because the UK is an island, it's got to bring in anything it wants to import from abroad by sea. In most cases, those imports are brought by ship, or by tunnel, or by air, but in two absolutely critical sectors, British resources come in via other means. Those two sectors are energy and information, and in both cases, supply travels into Britain from beneath the waves. In the case of energy, Britain relies on a network of oil and gas pipelines settled deep under the ocean to receive its imports from partner nations across the North Sea. And in the case of information, Britain receives the vast majority of its data and maintains internet connectivity to the outside world through undersea fiber optic cables. Both Britain's pipelines and its cables are essentially unguarded. British warships and patrol aircraft may look for trouble at the water's surface, and there's no telling what the Royal Navy's 10 submarines might be doing at any given time, but Britain's naval capabilities and the capabilities of other NATO nations that might help to defend those assets are nowhere near enough to ensure that every pipeline or every cable is monitored in full at any given time. That's always been a sort of slow-burning problem for the UK, the sort of thing that military leaders and defense experts could agree might be a problem someday, but that were difficult to justify protecting much better by devoting today's limited resources in today's limited environment. But since the start of Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, that calculus has been changing, as the UK has found itself staring down an adversary with a growing willingness to challenge Europe. But technological evolution has been arguably an even more important factor as unmanned underwater vessels, or UUVs, become a more and more important aspect of maritime warfare. As those UUVs become more common and hybrid warfare becomes a fact of daily life on the European continent, Britain's failure to protect its undersea assets has become more of a problem. Enter the Yantar, a disguised spy vessel that's been traveling through sensitive waters more and more frequently over the last year or so. In early 2025, the Yantar showed up in the North Sea and raised Britain's hackles to the point that, in order to deter the vessel, the Royal Navy actually surfaced one of its submarines right in front of the spy ship. That's not something that the UK would usually consider, but the threat of the Yantar sniffing around down there is an undeniable cause for concern. As far as the UK can tell, there's a very strong chance that the Yantar is trying to map all of those undersea cables and pipelines, figuring out where they're positioned and where they might be at their most vulnerable. As a former Royal Navy commander, Tom Sharp explained to the BBC when asked about Yantar's possible objectives, quoting, "The most obvious one is they sit above our cables and our undersea critical infrastructure, and they nose around in the cables that transfer up to $7 trillion worth of financial transactions every day between us and America alone." End quote. For a nation that's otherwise harder for Russia to target in its hybrid warfare efforts, these undersea pipelines, and especially the undersea fiber optic cables, represent a goldmine for Moscow in its operations against London. Although there's a level of redundancy built into London's fiber optic connections, Moscow would only need to destroy or incapacitate a small number in order to have a massive impact, disrupting life for tens of millions of Brits and grinding communications, finance, and other critical sectors to a halt. Attack Britain's pipelines, and Russia could cause an environmental catastrophe for Britain to deal with at the same time that it restricts British energy resources, possibly in the cold winter months. It wouldn't take much, just a few well-placed explosives that could remain underwater for months, or even UUVs navigating unseen toward predetermined undersea coordinates. The Yantar and other ships like it wouldn't even have to be in the vicinity. Indicating the sorts of actions that might already be underway, a suspected Russian tracking device was identified on the 15th of November off of the Welsh coast, an acoustic monitoring device called a sonobuoy that had imploded under pressure and then washed close to shore. It's an older device, and it's not likely to have been deployed by the Yantar, although it does give a bit of context as to how long Moscow has been focused on this part of the Atlantic. Most troubling of all, it's entirely possible that it could be too late to stop Russia from gathering the intelligence it needs. The Yantar has already been working in the area for too long. Other Russian vessels have operated in the same zones, and even if Russia's maps of British undersea resources are nowhere near complete, they don't need to be complete. In order to keep these resources safe, Britain has to protect all of them across their entire combined length, whereas Russia just needs to hit a few pinpoint spots in order to cause a catastrophe. We've said it before here on WarFronts, and with the way things are looking in Europe, we're probably going to have to say it again. These are the repercussions when European nations are slow to anticipate future threats, unwilling to invest in their own defense, and overly permissive when they could be responding to suspected threats by known adversaries. Under international maritime law, the Yantar is welcome to be wherever it is, doing whatever it's doing. But if, in a few weeks or a few months, a sequence of surprise explosions takes Britain offline or destroys its oil pipelines, then Britain's deep and abiding respect for maritime law is hardly going to make anything better. Parts of the British government are already aware of the problem. In a report in September, the nation's National Security Strategy Committee called the government out for its timidity in its approach to protecting the cables. But as of now, there's been no change. In the hybrid war playing out across Europe, one side has already decided that the gloves are off. The other side, at least right now, doesn't seem to agree. If Britain and its NATO allies are content to watch as their undersea cables and pipelines, their military bases, their airports, and their critical infrastructure are mapped, surveilled, and eventually targeted, then those nations are welcome to try and explain the consequences to their own people. But if those nations would rather avoid the pain of an escalating hybrid war, then the time to start doing something about the threats was yesterday. All they could do today is try and play catch-up, and it's not currently clear that they'll even do that. Thank you for watching.